If a guest is getting treated like a full member, it's a security incident. If I was in the org and the product and engineering workspace and also customer success, I would have 3 different users under the hood, all representing me, but not on each of the different workspaces. Even though we have a single user object for you, your association with the workspace is where the guest status was stored. But instead of making one big change after we do a year of work, we're going to be making a lot of little changes every day of every week. And each of those might cause an incident, but they're gonna be sub-freeze.
Today on Turn Stories, we have a very special guest. I have today Sarah Mann with me. Sarah is a software engineer at Slack, but she came from a background where she was actually a PhD in applied mathematics and had a whole career as a data scientist before getting into software engineering full-time at Rimeto, which was eventually acquired by Slack. So we're going to talk today about the intersection of those things, all of the amazing migrations that drove at Slack, and what that means for the future of how we actually fix these problems. So Sarah, welcome. I'm so glad to have you here.
Hi, happy to be here.
All right. So let's get right into it, because I want to understand a little bit about, you have a unique view on what reliability and quality and means within software engineering. So tell me a little bit about your role at Slack and the team and how you approach the problems they're solving.
Yeah, so for my last 3 years at Slack, I was on a team we called Storm Chasers, which had this sort of interesting mission of looking at trends in incidents that Slack was having, trying to identify patterns, and then seeing if we could solve the root problems under those. So some of the incidents that Slack was having, were very clearly owned by a particular team. There were people working on them. There were one-offs. But then there'd be these pockets of incidents where it's we keep having problems with this system, but no one team owns it. There were often very cross-functional issues. And Storm Chasers would step in and do anywhere from a week sprint to we spent almost 2 years on one of these, trying to fix it, usually with some multiple projects going on at the same time. So 2 of the bigger projects I worked on were around users. Users is you have users in most companies.
Slack has a couple.
You have a representation of users in data and in code that then every other product piece relies on, and usually no one team owns users. And so when there's problems with the fundamental data model or provisioning users or whatever, nobody has quite the agency to fix them. And so Storm Chasers worked on users quite a bit. And authentication was the other one that we spent actually the most time on.
Right on. So, okay, let's talk about actually, which one of those do you want to talk about first? Because I'm curious to hear both of those stories.
We might start with users just because it was our first Storm Chasers project, and it was actually the impetus for founding it.
Cool. Oh, interesting. So it's actually the foundational story of the team. Okay, so you mentioned that this is all driven by incidents and problems. What happened?
So with users, one of the big stories was issues with provisioning users and with keeping track of user state correctly. And to get in the technical why on that, we have to go back and talk a little bit about users at Slack and the enterprise product.
Okay.
So you and I were both at Slack, so we know all about this for listeners. So way back when, the beginning of Slack, you had a team at Slack and channels in that team and users on that team who were in channels. And then Slack had explosive growth, got lots of users, and some of those teams got really big. And so Slack had been engineered around the team as a fundamental unit, and we put all of the data for a team on a single shard. In the data stores. Mm-hmm. And when the teams got too big, we didn't have space in our data or CPU to run a single team. like that. So to be able to expand and support larger and larger teams, they came up with the enterprise grade product. And what they did is sort of said, larger companies usually have some subcomponents to them. What if we made each of those sort of sub companies, pillars, whatever, have their own team and stitch them together into a grid where they're in one organization with a lot of teams together? And so the way that looked at Slack is like the product and engineering org had their own team, and sales had their own team, and um, customer support had their own team, and they were all stitched together under the Slack org. Or maybe a company that like acquired a bunch of different companies. It was like a conglomerate. Each of the individual companies would have their own team. And so it was a way of being able to like make these bigger organizations work within the Slack architecture where each team had like a finite amount of compute and storage resource versus attached to it. And this worked and it was super successful. But the way that we did that is we like very literally stitched teams together under the hood. And we started calling them workspaces at this point. But it meant that you actually had a different user on each of the workspaces inside of an organization. So within Slack, if I was in the org and the product and engineering workspace and also customer success, I would have 3 different users under the hood, all representing me, but not on each of the different workspaces. And so now you have a problem of trying to keep all of those users relatively in sync. So there are
a little
some
bit of complexity, which almost always precedes reliability walls.
So like this allowed Slack to scale for a while, but then we spent a lot of time basically paying down this tech debt.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. One of my favorite like founding tidbits I heard about Slack is that Slack was designed, this was like conceptually, and it flowed down into some software for like teams of no more than like 50 people. Yeah, and then launching, it's fascinating to hear about like how the enterprise product basically said like, well, we can't unwind that assumption in order to get this product to market. Let's just take the building blocks we have and create a product out of it that ends up being successful, which is really cool.
Yeah, let's just duct tape them together, and it worked. But behind the scenes, it was very hairy. And so then we've like Slack's just been unwinding that for years now. And so one of the things that happened before I worked on users is we did a project called Single Enterprise Users, where we said, okay, instead of having n+1 users for user objects representing a single person, so n's the number of workspaces you're in, you get one more for the organization. So if you're in 100 workspaces, there are 101 users representing you. Let's take that down to 1. And so they did a lot of work to make that happen. And what we ended up with was a users table that has a single row per each user on an organization. And then a user's teams rows, which maps this user has some relationship to this workspace inside the organization. And so anything about that's specific to that workspace or team is in the user's teams table. Anything that's global is in the users table.
Straightforward enough.
Yeah, it sounds straightforward enough, except that when they were setting this up, there were some unknowns. And one of those was your, quote, guest status. So there are 3 different types of users in Slack. There are full members, which have that's what most people are. Multi-channel guests. So this would often be like if you're an organization that hires contractors, you might pull in the contractor as a multi-channel guest, and they have a couple of channels that they have access to, but they do not generally have access to join any public channel. And then there's single channel guests. So maybe you're working with an outside vendor and you have a channel that they have, a single channel they have access to work on the particular project, but they don't. They only have one of those. And that guest status is super important because if you get it wrong and somebody's supposed to be a single channel guest, but you treat them like a full member, they've suddenly got access to a bunch of public channels that they were not supposed to have access to.
Right.
And it wasn't super clear early on whether somebody could be a full member in one workspace within a grid and a guest in another workspace, or whether that should be a global property. And so that ended up getting stored on the user's teams table, so that we had the flexibility to say your guest status can be different on every workspace. Product evolved, it lived in the real world, and it became clear that that was not a tenable idea. We actually wanted the guest status to be locked in and consistent across all the workspaces. But we'd stored it in user teams, so it was written in n+1 places. So even though we have a single user object for you, your association with the workspace is where the guest status was stored.
Interesting.
Yes.
Okay.
So one of the trends of incidents we were seeing was things like that, where we were storing the information on users' teams, but it was supposed to be consistent for the user across all their teams. And when that information got changed, were we updating it in all of those locations correctly? And the answer was like, usually, but not always.
Oh, no.
In the extreme case of our power users for our biggest customers, a user could be in hundreds of workspaces. So when you make a change to any of these bits of information, it wasn't happening synchronously with the API request. We were offloading it to the job queue so we could go update hundreds of rows. But when you offload something to the job queue and do it asynchronously, you can have failures. And if you're holding the same information a bunch of different places and you have spaghetti code that can update it from lots of different places, you're going to make mistakes. And so we were making mistakes, and they were costly because, again, if a guest is getting treated like a full member, it's a security incident.
Yeah, those are bad incidents. I imagine you can't talk super specifically about it, but were there any memorable, like, specific presentations of this during incidents?
I'm not remembering anything super strongly,
Okay.
just that, like, we had multiple that were this flavor.
Yeah.
The other complicating piece on this, so not only were we storing this in the user's teams table, so in lots of different places, when we were provisioning users, this might get stored on the invite for the user.
Mm-hmm.
So I invite you to join my workspace. We have, a data row for that invite, and that invite says whether you're supposed to be a guest or a full member. You can revoke that invite. You can issue a new invite without revoking it. The new invite can have a different status on it.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I'm following.
And at the time we started this project, at the time when we sent the invite, we may or may not have also created a user at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So we might have just created invite and said, there's this invited person. They don't exist in the users table yet, but like this is how they should be created when they are created. Or we might have actually created the user and have a users row and an invite row for the same person that in theory have the same information, but if that invite is revoked and reissued, all that information is supposed to change and stay in sync. And which information do you trust? Do you trust the users row, or do you trust the invite row?
I'm not going to answer that question. Surely it will be wrong. Interesting. Okay, so there's when you first started describing this, I was thinking, okay, fine, that makes sense that you can simply the way you're accessing it, just keep the data in sync. It's a little twitchy, but that's fine. But even 3 or 4 examples deep, there's obviously a ton of ways that you can just miss. Even if you miss, like, the job queue fails to process a couple of jobs, and all of a sudden you have stale data, and now you have database problems. Okay, so not a great state. I am convinced.
So it's very complex, because even just thinking about it, you're like, what is the source of truth? And there's lots of ways for it to go wrong, and lots of complexity in the code, which is not a place you want to live in. And so this is a project that we ended up having 6 prongs of attack on, and I cannot list them all anymore, but I'll tell you about at least 2 of them.
I was going to say, give me your top 2.
I wrote a great deck on this at Slack, and it lives within Slack's information system.
Totally valid.
And it was long enough ago that I don't remember all 6 of them anymore. But
So how do you go after this?
we had a lot of meetings where we went, it works that way? Why? And our tech lead on the project, we had a document, it has section in it. Our tech lead was Izzy, and it has section called Izzy's List of Horrors, where we would just like, as we found new things that we were like, ooh, that's gonna burn us, we would add to it. So it was a little bit ad hoc. There was a lot of like exploration stage. But when we got more organized about this, the first like big thing that we did was we renormalized the tables. So we said, we now know more about how this product works. We know that the first decision we made has turned out to not be serving us. We will go change that decision. And so we moved the flag for the account status and a couple other flags from users' teams to users. So now it is stored in one place for the user, not n+1. And that means that when you change the status, it is synchronous.
That makes a ton of sense.
Makes a ton of sense. You're doing this on hundreds of millions of users, so it's like a process to rewrite the data and read from the new data and do it correctly.
How did you... Okay, so getting to the state where everything makes sense, yes, you should do that. But you were in a state where the data didn't make sense. Like, how did you make the decision when you ran into something that would have made Izzy's List of Horrors?
How do we decide what was on the list or how to address it?
How did you address it? How did you like rationalize what is fundamentally incompatible state with itself in the database?
Yeah, good question. I think on that one, we probably decided that the org level user had to be the correct one, and we read that one over. Although we might have in some cases taken the least privileged.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Is that if you've got something limited.
Yeah, and like fortunately, it wasn't like the database was like rife with these, because every one of these that was inconsistent like ends up being an incident. So it's like, it's not like this is not a case where we had hundreds or thousands or millions of problems in the database. This is a case where like even a handful could be an incident.
Yeah, there's the needle in a haystack kind of problem. Yeah,
this is
the data is mostly right.
Yeah, so it's like, it's a number where it's like you can inspect them and decide what they should be.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it means the project is done when you are confident it is done, not when it appears to be done, because it probably appears to be done now. Like it's 2 nines, 3 nines, 4 nines correct at this moment.
Yeah, but this is one more like any error is not acceptable.
Yeah, exactly. You're not trying to drive an error rate close to 0. Like it really needs to be 0.
Yeah. And so this is actually a theme of a lot of our work, is writing down what the data contracts are supposed to be. So this is a case that we've talked about of like, do we have the same guest status on every row? And then we make a dashboard about that. So we have a lot of companies do this, and Slack does. We snapshot the databases every day into our data warehouse, and then we have all of our analytics tools available to us. And so we can run dashboards in the analytics environment that looks at a snapshot of our production data, and we can say, tell me which ones are out of sync. And like, yes, you can go to the MySQL databases in production directly to do this, but you're querying production databases on a large scale and potentially affecting resource utilization in production. So you don't want to be doing that very regularly.
Yeah, a little scary. But having that data makes a lot of sense. I sort of want to pick at that, actually. So you created these dashboards. I want to come back to the other prongs of this project, but you're creating these dashboards. I have been handed a lot of dashboards in my career, and mostly my reaction to them is like, cool, thanks. And I never look at them again. How did you actually sort of like make progress based on these dashboards?
Yeah, I've written a lot of dashboards in my life, and they have a shelf life. And so while we're in the middle of the project, we were loading these daily, and eventually we finished the project and didn't look at them for a year. But in that time, we were both loading them daily. So you start out, you're like, the most important part is like, the engineers who write the system, they have some idea in their heads of how the system works. And they like kind of bake these assumptions into the code, into the data model, but they often don't write it down very explicitly. So now you're a couple of years later and you're looking at the code and nobody remembers what the assumptions are, but everyone's sort of making some assumptions about it. And so one of the first things you do is actually try and write those down very concretely. Guest status should always be the same. And then you can put that into a dashboard. And so we would usually do these over time because we have daily snapshots of the database. So we draw a graph over time of how many users in the database have an inconsistent guest status. And so maybe we're starting off with, a handful or 100. We do our backfill scripts to get everyone synced up. Then we at Slack had a system where you could run a query and analytics environment on a schedule, and if it returned any rows, it would fire off alert into a prescribed Slack channel. So we basically set up alerting against our analytics queries, and we'd say, we've in theory fixed all of these issues. If there's a new one, tell me.
That's cool. Oh, I love that approach. So you're, just to replay so I'm understanding, you write down just like explicitly what you're doing. You enshrine it in a query and go fix the problem, and you can see it fixed as you actually make it through the work. And then you enshrine, and then you quit using that dashboard, move on to the next thing, but set up an alert so you've like locked in the progress, and you know that you're not gonna have to go back and fix that in the future.
Yeah, because there's usually like two phases. There's like, we've got historical data problems and we need to fix those. And then there's the like, well, how did we get those historical data problems? Maybe there was like an incident a year and a half ago where the databases went offline for like an hour and we like didn't recover from it correctly. And we wrote some bad data some places. Okay, we need to recover that data, but maybe we have ongoing leaks, but you can't tell what they are because there's so much trash in the databases. So first you clean up the databases, and then you look for new occurrences of the problem. And by having that alerting, you know when it happens, and you know when it happens in real time, so you can go look at your logs while they're fresh. And then you can go do the debugging and say, what caused this? And is this going to be an ongoing thing? So you do like a lot of follow-up work on closing the holes, plugging them.
That's cool. Yeah. What caused this? What caused this today? What caused this at 2 p.m. when I got this error, this alert? Yeah, that's so much more tractable than what caused this sometime between the dawn of time and today.
Yeah. And so now in this example, that's not exactly how it went down because we actually just rewrote the data so that users was only in one place. But you can imagine this in other scenarios where like you do have relationships between data in various tables where they're supposed to be consistent in some way. If a user is deactivated, like, so they've been removed from an organization, maybe they need to be removed from all of the channels they were in or marked inactive in all of those channels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I can't remember off the top of the head if that's exactly how we do it, but like that would sound like a reasonable assumption. That's probably not written down somewhere, but you could write it down and you could write an analytics query against it and make sure that you have that data consistency that you expect.
Interesting. Yeah, so that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, that is a strategy that we use like over and over again on the various projects that we did. So that was like the one of the first big prongs of the user project was normalize the data. Another one was this situation with the invites. We were like, okay, like the invites, and you have the invites, you have the users rows, like who knows what's correct. We are going to make a declaration of how we think it should work that is going to make sense to people. And that is that when an invite is sent, we always create a user, and the user's row is the source of truth. So as things change, so maybe that invite is accepted and the user joins and then they get removed and then they get a new invite, it's still just the user's row. It's not the new invite that tells you it. The user's row should be correct. So when we get that new invite, we update the user's row. And the information on the invite itself is there for auditing purposes, but it is not the source of truth of the current state. The big change here is that we were sometimes creating users when the invite was sent and sometimes we weren't. And we were like, well, that is just too complicated for anyone to understand. And we said, we are always pre-provisioning users. There needs to be a users row once the invite is sent. Whether they show up in UI, different question, we have flags for that. But under the hood, they exist in our users table.
Yeah. Okay.
Getting that done took a year. Because of
a year.
Yeah.
Okay. What was that year?
So a lot of that was relatively easy, but it actually turned out that we had some team level settings that were controlling whether the user was created at time of invite. And we had to reach out to individual customers and say, like, we're changing the functionality of this setting. We need your like go ahead to do it. And the last customer to do that, it just like took us months to get them on the phone, make them understand what we were doing, explain to them that like it actually wasn't going to change their product experience, but we were sort of changing esoterically this setting that they had opted into. And it meant that we couldn't clean up a bunch of dead code for a really long time because we had to support this for way longer than we wanted to.
Interesting. But with the benefit of hindsight, would you have done anything differently?
I mean, I think we still made the right choice of like, I'm really happy that we, at the end of the day, were able to get us to the state we're in now, because new engineers at Slack like don't even ever have to know about some of these settings or any of this complexity anymore. Like it just isn't an issue, but it was painful to get there.
Yeah,
and that wasn't an engineering time issue. That was just like a communication time. Mm-hmm. We like did other projects in the meantime, and we came back and like after 6 months after we'd finished the main bulk of that project, we came back and did a sweep of code cleanup because we were finally able to delete some really complicated logic.
Yeah, I guess you have like a bi-weekly reminder that's like, go see if the customers responded to our emails yet. Interesting. So this is all motivated by trying to clean up the data such that it didn't have incidents. Did the fact that customers were blocking the sort of forward progress of this problem, like how do you manage the urgency between like this is causing real incidents and hiding real complexity that creates landmines for us but we're gated on having a customer understand how this feature is implemented?
Yeah. In this project, we had 6 prongs. And so, and anytime we were blocked on one, we would just go work on the other one. And so we had like some stack ranking of priority, but we had enough different things that needed to happen that getting blocked in one place, we were just like, we'll just go fix this instead for a while. We were also in this case able to, spend some of getting that one setting changed blocked us from being able to delete dead code, but it didn't block us from being able to do all of the refactoring of the existing code, right? We could make these deprecated functions that held the old logic, but we could still create the new functions with the simplified logic, have all of the new code paths in place, migrate 99.9% of our customers onto using this. Yet, in our dashboards, we just wrote in a like, if team ID is this one team who won't get back to us, ignore their data. Don't tell us about it because we know.
Don't end up with your team ID written into the Slack code base is like a goal of mine.
Yeah. In this case, it was an analytics query, so not like actually committed code, but like, yeah.
It's gonna be still. Don't be a specific customer on a dashboard.
Yeah. So like it was annoying because we weren't able, like there was still this like legacy code that people occasionally had to touch because it was still a live code path. But we were able to do most of the work up front and then like really just delete things later.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and if you're trying to pick away some like giant goal of like don't like make all of this consistent, you've got 6 different prongs for it. Going after it, you can work on any of it and you'll still make forward progress. That makes a ton of sense.
Yeah. One of the tricky things about all of our projects was actually figuring out when we were done. because there's like infinite work you can do around making users easy to work with in the Slack code base. Like they're just such a core concept. They appear everywhere. When have you made the code good enough?
So when have we made the code good enough?
We picked out our six prongs and we finished it. And in the hindsight of like, we did that. And the thing with incidents is it's not like we're having 15 incidents a day. We're having like a couple and only a small portion of them around users. It was enough that it really mattered to get it done, but you don't have a large enough value of data that you can like look at an incident trying to be like, here's the cliff where we fixed everything. You have to wait a year. But and then you can look back and be like, oh no, really, we aren't dealing with those types of incidents anymore. So it became clear once we got, 6 months to a year out of that project, we could actually pat ourselves on the back and be like, we haven't got called into an incident around like our users are correct. Are the users' data correct? Because we did fix it. But we had like these very intense conversations of like, what is above our cut line on making users dependable?
So I would love to know more about that, because there's this moment, I think, especially in like 2025, we're all fully on board with everything AI at this point, and the AI is going to write all of our code and fix all of our bugs, and it will never make these kind of mistakes, and that's obviously sarcasm. There is this thing that is happening that you're doing that is like very much engineering, but it's happening like in a room arguing with people about, no, if we do these 6 things, not these 8 things, not these 4 things, these 6 things, we will not have the number of incidents we want. Tell me a little bit about the decision process of like, how do you get the confidence to make a decision when you know that the data is going to take 6 months to roll up?
Yeah. In this case, we had a fabulous tech lead running this project who had been at Slack for a long time, had a really good like finger on the pulse and like intuition about what matters and like historical context about why various decisions were made in the past and what was feasible. In hindsight, I can say that we had a project that had 6 prongs, but we never had a roadmap that said that. That was like at the end of the project. It was like, actually, we had 6 things that we did, and like all of them were declarative statements about how things should work. So they were things like, when we send an invite, we create a user. It's a very simple statement. It's like, oh yeah, that sounds like it should be true. And it's like, well, it wasn't true. It was not true 6 months ago.
It was extremely untrue, and now it is true to the best of our knowledge.
Yeah. But on the day-to-day, it was like, it's always a balancing act of like, who do you have available to work on this project? What feels urgent at the moment, and what is blocking other work, right? So there's things that you do along the way. We haven't talked about typing code. So Slack is in Hackling. It was originally written in PHP. It moved over to Hackling, which is just a strongly typed version of PHP, but it meant that any legacy code was essentially untyped. We quote unquote typed the code base a few years ago when the latest version of HHVM required it, but you can have a typed code in Hackling where the type of a variable is mixed, i.e. not typed at all.
It's a type, I guess.
Yeah. And so, like invites code was a good example of, we've had invites for as long as we've had Slack. So like that is old legacy code. It had been hastily typed, and it was like very unclear of like which of these dictionaries has the flag for, is this user a guest?
Yeah, you can have strongly typed code where you store the same or competing data in multiple places, for sure.
Yeah. Or you can have, and what we had was loosely typed code where it was very unclear how anything was getting passed around. And so, like, while it was never one of the prongs of our project, was not like make all the user code strongly typed, and we did not achieve that, there were moments in it where it was like, well, I want to do X, Y, and Z, but like, I have no idea how this flag is getting passed around. So what I'm actually doing today is I'm strongly typing this dictionary as a shape now. Um, so there's some like ordering of, we're trying to do 6 things. Some of them are interdependent. So today I'm working on the thing that is not blocked.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And just at the end of the project, you look up and say, like, these are the things that we did fully and we believe are important to do. And the 7th thing that's core way done, maybe not.
Izzy's list of horrors was never complete. Never knocked everything off of it.
That's, I'd like to be surprised at that, but I'm not. um, what, as you were going through it, I'm curious if you sort of look back on your experience doing that. What tools were the most effective for you as you went through that process? And what tools would you like to exist that you couldn't find at the time?
Oh, yeah. So as I've mentioned, we use a lot of our analytics tools just to understand what was going on, as well as Logstash, Kibana, to like spend a lot of time sifting through our logging and adding logging, to understand what was actually happening in the code.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of refactoring the code, we did a lot of really manual work, because we were often making very subtle changes to functionality that weren't super amenable to automation. I think the other project I think we may talk about is around authentication, and there were some things in there that were more rote that tooling might have helped us with more. And I'm not sure in the user, it's like better tools for moving one column from a table A to table B, like might have helped, but it wasn't actually the bulk of our effort. The bulk of the effort was making sure that the code was updated to read from the new table correctly.
Yeah,
in all the right places.
It's interesting. I think there's actually something really real there around the problem is not the code. The problem is not the refactoring is hard and subtle, but or maybe the refactoring is straightforward, but the effect you're trying to achieve is hard and subtle and requires some local work before you get there. And the hard part is where you go into the logs, like you add logs and you check if they're there and you check that the behavior is there. Like that really resonates. The idea that the problem is not, I'm going to do a thing and then I'm going to reload the page and like the button will be blue and that makes sense. The hard part is I am trying to figure out in production, like what is happening here? And do I have a correct mental model of the world? And like, that's where you spend all your time. That's really interesting. And it's, I think, indicative of like a certain shape of problem that's not trivial.
Yeah, you're trying to unwind 10 years worth of logic and product decisions. Like, how's our product actually work today? In these like weird corner cases. Like it's obvious how it works in the majority case, but like in this odd combination of team settings, like how does the product actually work? And how should it work? Does that actually make sense? Um, that's tricky, and I don't know what tooling helps with that.
Yeah, cool. I love this. There's this piece here of I never thought of this idea of using like combining the idea of like graph driven development and really a focus on the data in production. I think that's a really interesting insight of just like a core motion of how you approach this kind of problem, like problems of this complexity. So that's super cool. I do want to shift gears. I want to talk a little bit about the auth migration,
which is great because it's another great example of how we did the exact same tool. The exact same trick we applied to
it works. Do it again.
A new situation.
Okay, so back to the beginning. Everything's incidents. What was wrong?
Any problem you have with authentication is a security incident. And so if it were any other, if you have a bug in authentication, that if it were not authentication would just be like a inconvenience to the user, call it like a Sev 3, is immediately a Sev 1 because it's a security incident.
Unpleasant.
And authentication is, again, one of those like primitives of any product. If you have users, they have to have a way to authenticate themselves and log into your product. And so it's one of the first things that you write. And that also means all of the code is the oldest code in the code base. And nothing else works if authentication doesn't work.
Yeah.
Scary
area.
Yeah. Of course, we have like security teams who work on some of this, but their focus is often more on discovering vulnerabilities than on owning it from a product sense. So there was another like lack of clear ownership moment, cross-functional moment, which is why storm chasers got involved. This is another case where we made some dashboards and like burn down problems. So there were actually two prongs to this project. I'm going to start with the second prong because it's most related to what we've been talking about, and then go back to the first prong in time order. So the second phase of this project was actually sort of a general mandate of make authentication work correctly all the time. Fundamentally, for authentication, to have access to Slack, you have a session written in a sessions table, and you have like a token associated with that session. And again, when you have state changes with users, you want to sometimes invalidate those sessions. So maybe the user gets logged out by an admin, all of their sessions should get invalidated. The user's kicked out of the team, all of their sessions should get invalidated. We have push notification tokens that are actually attached to the session for the mobile session. If you are logged out on mobile, you also shouldn't get push notifications. So this is another place where there should be some data contracts, right? If you look at a user and they're deactivated, they should not have an active session anymore.
Makes sense.
That makes sense. It should be true. Run an analytics query. Is it true? At the time, it was not. It is now. Which is the reason I'm talking about it.
Which is why
if it weren't true now, I wouldn't be telling you this.
Fair.
Yeah. Was it usually true? Probably. So we wrote this. We started this project, and this team, Storm Chasers, didn't have any particular domain knowledge about authentication. Authentication. I think I put in an extra syllable. And so one of the ways we organized our thinking about the project, and we just started this dashboard, which turned into like 15 or 20 queries, where we wrote down what the contract was on various tables about authentication. And we were like, we think these things should be true. Are they actually true? And the answer would be, oh, we have hundreds of millions of rows that are incorrect. And some of these,
Wild.
a lot of these are like not that big a deal. So like the example of this user has been removed from the team. Do they still have active sessions? Okay, yes, often that was true. Does that mean that they could access Slack? Generally, no. It's like our login processes, we're checking that the user is actually active to allow you to log in. But the issue when you rely on your application level logic is it can be wrong and somebody can change it. Versus in the sessions table, we had this column that's like, mark this session is inactive or like invalid. And all of our queries to log you in at the MySQL level filter out those rows that are inactive. So like once you've marked a session as invalid, you don't ever look at it again for most product stuff, right? It shows up on auditing pages. So it's like much safer if you've actually correctly labeled the session of like, this session is invalid, than if you're just relying on, well, the session should be valid and the user should also be valid and like the team should not be deleted.
Yeah. If it's simply marked in the data in a place where you can audit it, where you can know, and where everyone's actually reading from, then.
And you can filter at the MySQL level. So like it just never shows up in the back end if it's been marked as inactive or invalid. So we had hundreds of millions of rows like this across and on like multiple different dimensions of like, there's something about this that we feel like is incorrect. And we feel like authentication is a place where we should have a really strong data model and we should make our data adhere to it. And so then we started fixing the data, running backfills, and then setting up alerts, looking at our dashboards every day and plugging all the holes. So that same iterative loop.
Interesting. And so same process, just applying this lesson of like, go find, like, write down the data contract, figure out where you have the issues, and just like let's plow forward with it.
Yeah, because any of those drawers, like I said, like most of these, it's like we do enforce the logic, the application layer. So like, just because it's a little bit wrong in the database doesn't mean that we're in product doing anything untowards. But you're like one bug away from it.
Yeah.
So
yeah, you're one push away from disaster.
If your data is correct, now you're like a handful of bugs away from having an actual problem.
We're always only a handful away.
You've increased the number of bugs you have to have simultaneously to have an actual problem.
So as you're going through this, you were telling me before the show that you made a promise to yourself that you have not made with other projects. Tell me about that.
Okay, so this is the other prong of this project. So back to that, the enterprise data model at Slack that we were talking about earlier of when you're in an enterprise at Slack, as opposed to just a standalone team, you're probably a member of multiple workspaces. And since we just stitched these all together with duct tape and goodwill, the way it was built is that you have a session for every workspace. And that's annoying. That is hard to keep track of for all of the same reasons that having a user for every workspace was.
Which, as you mentioned before, could be hundreds of sessions.
Which could be hundreds of sessions. And we also had this product logic that if you had a session for any one workspace within the organization, well, like really, you should have a session for every workspace you're a member of, because we don't have different login flow for every workspace. It's just kind of a under the hood magic to make everything work that you happen to have a session for each workspace. And so we had some really fun logic sitting there that like, if we got a token and a cookie and we looked at it and realized that there are workspaces that you're a member of, but you didn't actually have the session, we would create it on the fly and you'd never know. But that means that we kept having incidents where we're like, okay, this user was logged in when they weren't supposed to be for a reason. Admin had removed them from the team. They thought they logged out, whatever, but they still were able to log in or were not correctly logged out. And we were like, well, where did this session come from? And it'd be this like wild logic about trying to maintain your sessions for the org. Make sure you have sessions.
That's the kind of report you don't want to get. This person's last day was yesterday, and yet they are not only still logged in, they are continuing to mint new sessions. From where?
Yeah, and not from a login.
And
again, I can tell you this because this is not how it works anymore. So just as with users, there had been a project to go down to a single enterprise user. We then had a project to do a single enterprise session. So you get one session that is at the org level that grants you access to every workspace you are a member of in that organization. So we don't use sessions to track. We use sessions as a top level access. And then we use team membership and channel membership to track what within the organization you should have access to. So we started thinking about this project in December, and we'd been wanting to do this. It'd been like a known thing that everyone wanted to do for a while, but we were just getting our heads in the game. And in January, I realized a major complication on this and just how dicey this was going to be. And so I had this New Year's resolution that I was like, we're going to have to like delete hundreds of millions of sessions and regenerate new ones and swap out a bunch of tokens.
Yeah, sure.
So New Year's resolution, I don't ever make use of New Year's resolutions. We're not going to take down Slack. There will be no sub zeros, no sub ones in this project.
I love it.
We will have sevs 2s, 3s, and 4s. So we will have lower severity incidents. They're almost certainly unavoidable. But we are going to structure this project so that instead of making one big change after we do a year of work, we're going to be making a lot of little changes every day of every week. And each of those might cause an incident, but they're going to be sub 3s. And we pulled it off.
Amazing. Okay, so you got to tell me, how do you do that?
Yeah, so it turned out that the most complicated aspect of this was another weird side effect of how we've written everything. So because you were supposed to have a session for every workspace you were a member of, we made this hack that of a lot of the time when the product wanted to know what workspaces you were in, it didn't ask workspace membership, it asked the sessions table. So for example, if you go into a part of a product where it like asks you for the workspace, where it shows you a list of your workspaces, that was backed by sessions.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Sort of.
Given everything else you've just said, if you had said
works.
that 20 minutes ago.
So the sidebar, for example, it has, like you're an organization, it has all your workspaces. That was actually coming out of your sessions. And when you went into admin and you're like, oh, you want to like add a member, what workspace? Well, that's not a good example. You want to set up an app. What workspaces should the app have access to? And you can only add them to workspaces you're a member of. That drop down was backed by your sessions.
Okay, yeah.
So now you're changing the fundamental data model, right? You no longer have a session for every workspace. So every piece of product that is depending on that, it needs to be updated.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is one that we just started writing new code. We wrote a whole new framework for how do you interact with the authenticated user in the back end and what workspaces they should have access to. And there's basically like this one function that was load bearing for the old way, and it had about 300 references. And we just had to burn through them and move all of them one by one, sometimes a handful at a time, but all of them manually over into the new framework that was now backed by, okay, you have access to the organization. What workspaces are you a member of in the organization?
Okay, so you got 300 call sites to go through, and there is and they are all extremely capable of causing an incident. What does actually moving over one of those call sites look like safely? Like, how do you know? Like, it's not that you can do 299 of them. The last one's going to break. Like, how do I find the last dangerous call site? How do you actually go through doing this safely?
Yeah. So I picked out like 100 of them in the first week because 100 of them were actually just saying like, is this particular user ID currently authenticated? And so they were doing this like weird, like they were asking for all of the user team pairs that they were authenticated on when all it needed to do was like, is this user authenticated? And so it was very easy to build the helper function in the new world because like, you don't care about the team anymore. It's just like, is this user ID authenticated? And that's like a super easy Boolean function to write. And so like there was just a batches of them that was like, actually the question you're asking is simpler than what you're doing. So like, let's give you a good helper function to do it.
Yeah.
And then there were these like absolute landmines. There was something around crumbs that I think I had to, I tried to rewrite it and reverted it 3 different times. And I do not remember any of the details of what it was, but it was like the pain of my existence for 6 weeks. I kept trying to touch it and got it wrong. Like fortunately the new logic was, I want to say easy to write the equivalent of, but it actually wasn't.
Seemed easy.
In some ways easy to write the equivalent of and move over. There were some like really interesting nuances in there. Like um, uh, when you're making a list of workspaces, maybe you're in 100 of them. So how do we order them? Mostly alphabetical, but whichever is the last one you were actually looking at in product should be on top. And so how did we track that? That was a thing that was like, you can't actually just look at the team membership table for that. So we had to move some of that logic over. So there's some interesting nuances of
Yeah,
those.
interesting. That's cool. That
Um,
I love this insight that each of those call sites nominally uses the same function, nominally needs the same functionality, but like actually it doesn't. It's just a really rich source of information.
exactly.
A third of them are asking like the world's easiest question, like, are you authenticated? Full
Yeah.
stop. And then some of them are asking these incredibly complex questions where you need most of the data, but and you should treat them differently. Like discovering which ones deal with what types of data is the question.
Right. And one of the benefits in the end was that like we now have these different helper functions. And so it becomes very obvious in the code what question is actually being asked. Does this piece of code actually need to know everywhere you're logged in, or just knowing, is this user logged in enough? Should this user have access to this workspace? If that's the only question you're asking, there's an obvious helper function, and it becomes obvious in the code that that's the question you're answering, versus like getting back this list and doing a for loop through it to find if you're in the one that you're looking for.
Yeah, that makes so much sense.
And because we did it this way, it meant that every time we did one of these migrations, like that's a point where you can have a sev. But if you're like team picker on a like an app installation page is a little wonky, that's a sev 3. like no, it's not good, but you have not taken down Slack for everyone.
Yeah, I love
Whereas
that.
like, we did all of this at once and you had 50 things that were broken. Like, that gets bad.
Yeah, absolutely. And by knowing it sort of like ladders up of like, from going from what is this powering to what can we change about it to where does it appear to the user, like that sets your sensitivity. Like once you know that, like you have to know those things or you're just throwing darts and hope it doesn't land on Sev 1.
Yes, and you can make judgment calls of like, can I do 15 of these in one PR and just push it out and walk away from it? Or like, should I do this one and put it behind an experiment where I have an instant on off toggle on it where I can revert back to old functionality immediately? So when you're in something where your spidey senses are going off of like, this feels dicey, you have an appropriate tool for it.
Very cool. So how'd you do? Did you have any Sev 1s?
We did not take down Slack.
Congratulations.
One of the interesting things about that project, though, is like we did have sensitive 2s and 3s and 4s, which we expected. About half of them we discovered but did not cause. So you start looking at the code and you get in there and you start going, that's not how that should work.
Oh, we've been having an incident for 6 months.
3 years.
No.
We opened incidents where like this has been a issue in the code for as long as we can tell. And this is also the thing about the dashboard, right? Is like we had a sort of joke rule on the team of don't look at logs on a Friday afternoon. Because we had a habit of like we'd put in logging to try and understand how something worked, and then it'd be Friday afternoon and like what have you been working on that week? You kind of wrapped up, but you don't want to start the next like really hairy PR. So you're like, let me go check on that logging I added yesterday. And then if that logging is interesting and you dig a few more layers deep and you're like, oh, we've been in an incident for 3 years.
Oh wow.
And it's 4:00 on a Friday afternoon. And you have to call the incident, and nobody wants to be in an incident.
You're obligated at that point because you know what's happening. You can fix it. No one even deployed anything. You were trying to avoid this.
Yes. So yeah, we discovered at least as many incidents as we caused.
That's I think that's such a theme of any of these bigger changes that like when you're adding typing, I don't think this was on a show. I think this is just someone I talked to, is that they discovered that their code base had two fully different types of, or fully different installations of Django. It turns out you can do that. There's like forks available, I think. They both use the request object. The request object duck types to each other, and you can mostly use them interchangeably. But if you start adding types, you realize that you cannot, in fact. And there are runtime errors, and your users have been hitting them, and you have just never thought about it or caught them.
Yeah, isn't that fun?
So now it's 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and that's what you're going to do for the next 4 hours.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, we're coming up on time. How did that authentication now works correctly? How did you decide that you were done with that? Like, were there end prongs that you hit, or what was the end of that project?
So the project around doing a single enterprise session had a really clear end, because at some point there were no longer workspace level sessions. There were only top level sessions.
Mm-hmm.
Full stop.
Nice and clear.
And then you delete some more code. And
Wonderful.
then you walk away from that part. The other prong of this project, so we actually did single enterprise sessions first, and then we did a sort of more generic, like, and we generally need to have good data integrity around that. And so we had some things of like all these data contracts. We got the most important ones cleaned up the existing code, followed up on a lot of holes, got to a place where we felt very confident on it. We did a lot of refactors on this. This was, all this code was originally written as PHP. We've moved a lot towards object-oriented programming and hackling. So we did a lot of re-encapsulation of the various objects. One of my favorite pieces of that project was, we talked about how a token and a cookie can give you access to like a bunch of different workspaces in the org. So how we unpack that, how we go from that token and cookie to which workspaces you should be in, we had at least 3 different functions that were doing that when we started the project, and they were all doing it slightly differently. And so by the end of the project, we had one way that we were unpacking that information. And that was all everyone used the same one way. And we debated a lot on the cut line of when we were going to stop working on that. And there's always more to do. There's always more.
Absolutely. But there's another trend of instance. Probably pulls you away.
Yeah. There's my favorite trick on data integrity stuff. Do we have time for one more story?
Absolutely.
Okay. So this is a trick that we've used a couple of times, but the first time I used it was at Rimeto. Rimeto, we built a workplace profiles for companies. And so we'd import data from the companies and do this like cool, like polished profile about users and what they worked on, what teams they were on, their background, all that stuff. Our data model was a graph. The founders were Facebook people. Everything was a graph. And so we functionally had 2 tables. We had objects and associations. And the data was somewhat dynamic, so it would change daily. And we would make sure that we had the correct information, but we wouldn't necessarily clean up and delete old information. So for example, like if an employee left the company, we might process that by removing their association from the company's object to the employee's object. But we wouldn't necessarily synchronously delete the employee. So we had these jobs to then do that cleanup. So we called them like the orphan checker. Go through all of the objects and see if any of them are orphaned, i.e. disconnected from the graph. And so this was mostly like to improve the usability of the tables, but it didn't affect the product directly. It didn't affect what you could see in product, but it kept our tables clean. The job to do this was taking like 8 to 12 hours to run, because it was picking up every object in the database and saying, are there any associations between the object and the other object? If not, delete it. But it was doing it like one at a time. It was streaming through them. And so one of the things that I did in Rimeto as I set up their data warehouse. And so we set up scrapes of the database into an analytics table. Notice a theme. So now once you have that, so at Rimetto, we were using Snowflake. Snowflake is great at running these big queries where you do joins between multiple tables. So we rewrote the Orphan checker as SQL queries. That can then identify for you where your orphans are, but it's a different system from your production data. So you just take that and you dump it in a CSV. And then you go have your production jobs read from that CSV that we then call hints. So the analytics infrastructure has told you, as far as we can tell, here are your orphans.
Mm-hmm.
The production jobs that have, read-write access to my SQL then picks it up and says, okay, let me double check. Is this an orphan? Okay, delete it. Do whatever the job is on it. And it took the runtime of our orphan checking jobs down by like 99.5%.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
It went from running in like 12 hours to like 10 minutes. Like,
I love that.
And so that's one that we reused when we were doing sessions, because there's another one where there are hundreds of millions of sessions at Slack. And so we were starting to write these scripts to invalidate them. The first time you do that run, you do need to kind of go and inspect all of them. But as like we're discovering holes along the way and wanting to plug them, we don't need to go read a whole 100 million of them. We know from our analytics dashboards which 20 of them are the new problem today. And so we did the same trick. We wrote back to a CSV file, and then we had a job that we would manually kick off that would say, here's your hints file, go run it, and it runs in seconds. Instead of loading your database, reading every row, and checking it against 4 different tables.
That's really cool. That's an awesome trick. And like you saw across multiple companies, like it's a generalizable pattern. You can do this if you have any kind of, well, we have this wobbliness in our production infrastructure. Let's go find the hints, write it to a CSV, and then have the production infrastructure do a very small cleanup.
Yeah, now you're doing a targeted cleanup that runs quickly and it is not imposing a burden on your production infrastructure.
Yeah, that's a do it this afternoon kind of project. I love that. That's very cool. Well, this has been fantastic. I think there's some really super practical lessons in here, which is really fun. Two questions as we wrap up. Where can folks find you on the internet? And is there anything our audience can do to help you?
I exist on LinkedIn, and don't exist very publicly anywhere else.
Very cool. We'll find your LinkedIn, drop it in the channel description or the description for the video.
Yeah. And I did leave Slack in April, and I've been taking the summer off, but I'm going to be starting to look at jobs this fall. So
right on. There's, I'm sure, a ton of people who could use the kind of approach you bring to these kind of migrations. So I'm sure you'll hear something from someone in the audience. All right. Sarah, thank you so much. This has been amazing.
Thank you. It's been very fun to talk to you.